The soldiers moved through the crowded market like shadows cast by searchlights. Their boots struck the cobblestones with the sharp precision of men who believed they owned every inch of ground beneath them. Eyes scanned faces, hands rested on holsters, and the morning air carried the metallic scent of tension that had hung over this occupied city for nearly a decade. They were searching for someone, a ghost. A legend whispered about in basement meetings and coded messages slipped between blackout curtains. Someone who had stolen military secrets, redirected supply routes, and fed information to resistance networks for years. Someone they had sworn, repeatedly, did not exist. What they did not know, as they passed the fruit vendor arranging apples with careful hands, was that the person they hunted stood less than 3 feet away. She smiled politely as an officer bought oranges, her accent flawless, her paperwork immaculate, her entire existence a masterpiece of deception so complete that even now, with hunting dogs and intelligence officers combing every neighborhood, she remained invisible. Not because she was hidden, but because she had become someone else so thoroughly that the original person had nearly ceased to exist. This is the story of how one woman fooled an entire army for 10 years. Not through luck. Not through magic, but through intelligence, iron will, and the understanding that the most effective place to hide is often in plain sight. It is a story that reveals how assumptions can be weaponized, how identity can be armor, and how a single mind, operating in silence, can outlast the machinery of occupation. It begins not with a dramatic escape or a daring mission, but with a decision made in a moment when survival and resistance became the same thing. The city fell on a Tuesday in early autumn when the leaves had just begun to turn. The army that marched through its gates came with proclamations printed in 3 languages and a bureaucratic efficiency that was somehow more terrifying than the tanks. Within weeks, checkpoints appeared on every corner. Within months, new identification cards were issued, stamped with eagle emblems and serial numbers that reduced human beings to entries in a database. The occupation was thorough, methodical, designed to crush not just military resistance, but the very idea that resistance was possible. The army believed it had established total control. They had the weapons, the infrastructure, the documentation systems, the informant networks. They controlled food distribution, travel permits, employment authorization. Every aspect of life flowed through their administrative machinery. And because they controlled the paperwork, they believed they controlled reality itself. This would prove to be their fatal assumption. She had been a university student before the invasion. 23 years old, studying languages and literature with the kind of quiet intensity that her professors found promising, but not particularly remarkable. She spoke 4 languages fluently, could mimic accents with uncanny precision, and possessed a memory that retained details most people never noticed in the first place. Her real name, was entered into university records and student housing registries and library cards. That person, the one who existed in documents and photographs, would need to disappear. What made her capable of what came next was not heroism in the conventional sense. It was something colder and more practical. She understood systems. She understood that bureaucracies run on paperwork, assumptions, and the human tendency to see what they expect to see. She understood that soldiers occupying a foreign city did not truly see the people around them as individuals, but as categories: friendly, hostile, useful, irrelevant. And she understood that if you could control which category you appeared to belong to, you could move through a surveillance state as if its walls did not exist. The first lie began with a set of documents. Not forged documents, though those would come later. These were real papers, issued by the occupation authority itself, made possible by a clerk who asked fewer questions than he should have, and a photograph that showed a face slightly different from the one that had smiled in student identification photos just months before. The change was subtle: a different hairstyle, different glasses, a harder expression. Enough that the casual observer would not make the connection, but not so dramatic that it seemed like disguise. She became someone new. A translator working for the Occupation Administration. A woman whose linguistic skills made her valuable to officers who needed to communicate with the local population, but could not be bothered to learn the language themselves. Her new identity came with a work permit, a residence authorization, a small salary, and most importantly, access. Access to offices where reports were filed. Access to conversations that assumed anyone in the room wearing the right identification badge must be trustworthy. Access to information that, carefully collected and quietly passed along, could save lives. The decision to assume this identity was irreversible from the moment she walked into the administrative building with her new papers and reported for her first day of work. There was no going back. Her old life, her old name, her old self had to be buried so completely that even thinking about them became dangerous. Memory itself became a minefield. Every interaction required constant calculation. Every conversation was a performance where a single wrong word, a single misplaced reference, a single moment of forgetfulness could mean exposure, interrogation, execution. Living inside the lie meant remaking herself down to the smallest details. She learned to walk differently, to hold her body with the posture of someone who believed they belonged in administrative buildings guarded by armed soldiers. She trained herself to respond to her new name with the automatic reflex that most people reserve for their birth names. She created a false history, memorized it, embellished it with invented aunts and childhood memories, and a dead husband who explained why she lived alone and kept to herself. The lies became so detailed, so thoroughly inhabited, that they developed their own internal consistency. Every morning she woke up and put on the mask. Every morning she walked past checkpoints where soldiers nodded to her because her papers were always in order. Every morning, she sat at a desk in an office that smelled of cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink, translating documents and listening to conversations that revealed troop movements, supply shortages, intelligence priorities. And every evening, she returned to her small apartment, locked the door, and carefully committed what she had learned to memory before burning the mental notes into her consciousness where no search could find them. The information she gathered moved through networks she never fully saw. A conversation in a market, a note tucked into a library book, a phrase spoken to a priest in a confessional booth. The resistance operated like a nervous system with no visible brain, messages passing through channels that closed behind them the moment they were used. She rarely knew what happened to the intelligence she provided. She never sought credit or recognition. The goal was never glory. The goal was survival and the sabotage of an occupation that had declared itself permanent. Years passed this way. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. The occupation dug in deeper, built more infrastructure, printed more regulations. The army rotated personnel, but the system remained, growing more confident in its own permanence. And she remained inside it, a ghost haunting the machinery of control, stealing its secrets while wearing its uniform. The deception succeeded for so long because it exploited every assumption the occupiers made about the people they had conquered. They assumed that anyone working in their administration must be either collaborator or coward. They assumed that a woman in a clerical position posed no threat. They assumed that their identification systems were secure, their personnel vetting thorough, their control total. Each assumption became a blind spot she could operate within. The bureaucracy itself became her camouflage. The occupation ran on paperwork, and paperwork is both the strength and weakness of authoritarian systems. Strong because it creates records and procedures that can be enforced. Weak because those same systems become so complex that no one person understands all of it. She learned to exploit the gaps, a form filed in one office that was never cross-referenced with records in another, a signature requirement that could be satisfied through strategic timing, a filing system so Byzantine that documents could be delayed, rerouted, or lost in ways that appeared to be administrative incompetence rather than sabotage. The army fooled itself, ultimately. They built a system designed to control every aspect of occupied life, but the complexity required to maintain that control created vulnerabilities. Information had to flow through human beings who made assumptions, got tired, cut corners, trusted credentials instead of conducting real scrutiny. And because the occupation was foreign, because the officers did not truly understand the culture they were attempting to dominate, they missed signals that locals would have caught immediately. Sexism worked in her favor more times than she could count. Male officers discussing sensitive operations in her presence because to them, a female translator was essentially furniture. Strategic documents left on desks because the woman who cleaned the office and happened to read 4 languages could not possibly pose a security risk. Assumptions about women's capabilities, women's loyalties, women's intelligence created blind spots large enough to hide an entire resistance network. But the psychological cost of maintaining this deception, day after day, year after year, was crushing in ways that no external observer could fully comprehend. Fear became a constant companion, a low-grade fever that never broke. Every knock on the door could be the security police. Every unusual question from a colleague could be a test. Every change in routine, every new regulation, every tightening of security protocols meant recalculating risk and adjusting the performance. The isolation was perhaps worse than the fear. She could not tell anyone who she really was, not neighbors, not the few friends her false identity cultivated for appearance's sake. Certainly not family, assuming any had survived. The person she had been was gone. The person she pretended to be was a fiction. Somewhere between those two identities, the actual human being existed in a state of constant erasure, maintaining both lies simultaneously while having no space to simply be. There were moments when she forgot which version was real. Moments when her false name felt more natural than her birth name. Moments when the invented memories seemed more vivid than actual childhood experiences that were fading into dreamlike unreality. The deception was so complete that it began to consume the person maintaining it. Identity itself became slippery, uncertain, a thing that could be put on and taken off until the boundaries dissolved entirely. Sleep became difficult. Dreams betrayed her with fragments of her real past, memories that could be dangerous if spoken aloud in her sleep. She learned to sleep lightly, to wake herself if she felt a dream becoming too vivid, too revealing. Exhaustion accumulated over years until it felt like the normal state of existence. The loneliest moments came during holidays and celebrations when the occupation administration held parties and she had to attend, had to smile and make conversation and pretend to be grateful for the opportunity to serve. While around her, in darkened apartments and hidden basements, people whose language she spoke and whose stories she carried in her blood were mourning losses and planning resistance. She belonged to neither world fully. She was a bridge between them, necessary but always separate, always performing. The most dangerous close call came in the 7th year. A new intelligence officer arrived, younger and more paranoid than his predecessors, convinced that the recent increase in resistance activity meant the administration had been infiltrated. He initiated a comprehensive security review. Background checks were redone. Employees were re-interviewed. Personnel files were cross-referenced against population registries from before the occupation. She learned about the investigation 3 days before her own interview was scheduled. 3 days to prepare for questions about a life she had invented 7 years earlier. Questions asked by someone trained to detect deception. There was no way to run. Disappearing would confirm guilt and endanger everyone in the network. The only option was to walk into that interview and convince a professional interrogator that a fiction was reality. The preparation was meticulous. She rehearsed every detail of her false biography until she could produce them with the casual imprecision of genuine memory. She created tiny contradictions in dates and details, the kind of small errors that real memories contain but fabricated stories often lack. She practiced emotional responses, allowing herself to show exactly the right amount of nervousness, enough to seem human, not enough to seem guilty. The interview lasted 3 hours. The officer was thorough, circling back to earlier questions with slight variations, searching for inconsistencies. He asked about her childhood, her education, her dead husband. He asked why she had volunteered to work for the occupation. He asked if she had contact with resistance elements. Every question was a trap that could snap shut if she hesitated too long or answered too perfectly. What saved her was the very completeness of her assumed identity. She had lived it for 7 years. The reflexes were genuine. When he asked about her husband, she did not have to fake the brief flash of pain that crossed her face because the invented grief had become real through repetition. When he questioned her loyalty, the indignation in her voice was authentic because she had genuinely internalized the cover story she performed every day. Near the end of the interview, he pushed a photograph across the desk, a university class photo from before the occupation. Her face was in it, the real her, the person who was supposed to no longer exist. Time crystallized into a single moment of absolute danger. Recognition would mean death. Denial would seem suspicious. Her mind calculated options in the second it took to glance down at the photograph. She looked at it carefully, pointed to another face, someone she had vaguely known, remarked that the girl looked familiar, perhaps someone from her neighborhood before the war. Then, with perfect casualness, she mentioned that she herself had never attended university, that her education had ended with secondary school because her family could not afford more. The lie was already in her file. She was simply repeating established information. The officer studied her face for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. The interview was over. She had passed. Walking out of that building, her legs barely supported her. The fear she had suppressed during the interrogation flooded through her system all at once, adrenaline and terror mixing into something that felt like nausea. She made it 3 blocks before ducking into an alley and vomiting. Then she straightened, composed herself, and walked back to her apartment as if nothing had happened. Because the performance never stopped. Even in that moment of private collapse, she could not afford to be seen as anything other than the loyal administrator who had successfully cleared a routine security check. After that, the paranoia intensified. She varied her routes. She paid attention to whether the same faces appeared too often in different locations. She stopped passing information for 3 months until the heightened security environment relaxed. The network understood. Silence was sometimes the most effective form of resistance. The years continued their slow grind. 8 years. 9. The occupation became a permanent feature of the landscape, normalized in ways that made the life before it seem mythical. New children grew up knowing only checkpoints and curfews. The resistance continued, but changed character, becoming less about liberation and more about survival, about maintaining some core of identity that the occupation could not touch. She turned 31 inside her false identity, then 32. The woman she had been at 23 existed only in photographs, hidden in places she would never visit and memories she could not afford to access. Sometimes she wondered if she would recognize that person, if somehow they could meet. Probably not. The deception had not just hidden her, it had transformed her into something else entirely. The truth finally emerged not through her own exposure, but through the collapse of the occupation itself. The army that had seemed permanent began to crumble under pressures that had nothing to do with anything happening in the city. The war that had brought them was being lost elsewhere. Supply lines failed. Orders from command became contradictory, desperate. Units began withdrawing. The end, when it came, was chaotic. The administrative buildings were abandoned, files were burned, personnel fled, and she walked out of the office where she had worked for nearly a decade, locked the door behind her with a key she had no reason to return, and simply left. The resistance networks that had operated in darkness for years suddenly surfaced, trying to establish order in the power vacuum. She made contact with the handlers she had only known through coded messages. They were shocked to learn who she had been, where she had hidden. The intelligence she had provided over the years had shaped operations, saved lives, redirected resources in ways that contributed to the eventual collapse. But liberation brought its own complications. The city that emerged from occupation was different from the one that had been invaded. People were different. Trauma had rewritten everyone, and she was confronted with a question she had avoided for 10 years. Who was she now? Her real name felt foreign. The identity she had assumed was a costume that no longer fit. The person she had become during the deception was someone who existed only in relationship to a system that no longer existed. She stood in the space between identities, belonging fully to none of them. Some of the people she had worked alongside in the administration faced justice, trials for collaboration. She could have testified, revealed what she had done, claimed recognition. She chose not to. The deception had required anonymity. Maintaining that anonymity afterward felt like completing the mission. Only a handful of people ever knew the full truth. She left the city eventually, started over in a place where no one knew any of her names, lived quietly. The skills that had kept her alive during the occupation, observation, adaptation, reading people, remained sharp, but she used them differently now, for survival of a gentler kind. The legacy of what she did is complicated and profound. On the surface, it is a story about successful espionage, about how one person operating inside an occupation structure provided intelligence that contributed to eventual liberation. But the deeper truth is about the nature of resistance itself, about how it operates not just through dramatic acts, but through sustained daily defiance that leaves no visible trace. Her story reveals how power, even when it appears total, is always incomplete. The occupation controlled territory, weapons, documentation systems, but it could not control what existed inside the minds of the people it attempted to dominate. Every assumption the army made created a vulnerability. Every bureaucratic system complex enough to maintain control was complex enough to be subverted. The very tools of oppression became the instruments of its defeat. It reveals something about identity as well, about how the self is both more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. She survived by becoming someone else so completely that the original person nearly disappeared. But some core element remained, the part that chose deception over submission, silence over safety, sustained resistance over visible heroism. What she accomplished required intelligence, certainly. It required extraordinary discipline and psychological endurance. But perhaps most importantly, it required the understanding that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is to make the powerful believe they have won while quietly, systematically proving them wrong. One woman, for 10 years, lived inside a lie so complete that an entire army never suspected. She stole their secrets, undermined their operations, contributed to their eventual defeat, all while sitting at a desk in their own administrative building. She won not through strength, but through intelligence. Not through visibility, but through calculated invisibility. Not through one dramatic act, but through 10 years of daily courage that no one witnessed and few would ever know about. The occupation fell, the army withdrew, the city rebuilt, and she walked away from it all, carrying the weight of a decade spent being someone she was not, serving a cause that could never acknowledge her, living a life that could never be fully told. In the end, what her story proves is that occupation can control streets and buildings and bureaucratic systems, but it cannot control the human capacity for resistance when that resistance operates at the level of individual consciousness and sustained will. One mind, properly applied, with enough patience and intelligence and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat, can outlast armies. Not because it is stronger, but because it understands something that armies, with all their weapons and structures, often fail to grasp. That the most impenetrable fortress is the one built inside a human being who has decided that some part of themselves will remain free no matter what external circumstances demand. She fooled them all for 10 years, and in doing so, proved that even in the darkest moments of occupation and control, resistance is always possible. It just requires the courage to become invisible, the discipline to maintain the deception, and the faith that eventually, truth finds its moment to surface. Even if that moment comes quietly, years later, in the story of a woman whose real name most people will never know.